It all began on a storm-lashed highway. A young girl frozen in fear, a giant pit bull facing death, and a truck's headlights slicing through the rain like judgment. In her trembling hands, a worn leather journal, her mother's last gift, with just one message written in faded ink: trust Raven. What happens next is not just a story about dogs and humans. It's about healing, about bravery, about the pieces of ourselves we think we've lost forever, only to find them again in the unlikeliest places. This is more than a video. It's a powerful reminder that even the darkest night will end, and the sun will rise. Victor Hugo, stay with us until the end. The lesson hidden in this story might just change your life. The rain poured like a curse from heaven, cold and relentless, drenching the winding mountain road until it gleamed like a serpent made of black glass. Thunder cracked the sky open, and in that fleeting flash of light, a massive dog appeared, a silhouette forged in muscle and purpose, standing defiantly in the path of an oncoming semi-truck. Tires screeched. Metal cried. And then, "Dad, stop." The girl's voice, sharp and raw, pierced through the sound of the storm. Ellie Harper, barely 12, stood frozen at the edge of the road, her soaked hoodie clinging to her small frame, fingers clenched around a worn leather journal, the only thing left of her mother. Her lips trembled, her voice stuck in her throat. But she had read the first page again and again. Trust Raven. The headlights flared. A horn blasted. And there she was, Raven. The same giant pitbull who had once been more than just a dog. She'd been a therapy companion, a protector, a silent guardian of her mother's clinic. Her fur, once sleek, was now matted with rain. A jagged scar trailed from her right eye down to her neck. But her eyes, those deep, copper eyes, still carried the same fierce calm. Ellie remembered. In front of Raven, a tiny puppy whimpered, drenched and shivering. He looked barely 2 months old, with soft fur dark as midnight, save for one single, unmistakable white streak across his paw. Ellie blinked. Her mother used to call markings like that the print of purpose. None of it made sense. Not the puppy. Not Raven's return. Not the timing. Ellie had been silent for weeks, since the night the clinic burned down, since the accident that took her mother, since Raven vanished without a trace. She and her father had driven up to Ridge Hollow that day to donate canned goods and medical supplies to a small shelter, a healing ritual her dad believed would help her talk again. But Ellie hadn't spoken, not until she saw the puppy dart onto the road, not until Raven exploded from the forest like a shadow born of memory and muscle, not until that truck turned the corner too fast. Everything since that moment had become a blur. Her father's knuckles, white on the steering wheel, the truck fishtailing in the rain, her own scream tearing out from a place she thought had shut down forever. Now, the world held its breath. The driver, a panicked man in his 60s, stumbled out of the cab, shouting over the wind, "Robert Harper." Ellie's father threw open the truck door and rushed to where the animals stood. The puppy trembled like a leaf. Raven's chest heaved, but she didn't flinch. Even as the tires smoked just inches away, Ellie didn't move. Couldn't. The journal pressed against her chest, throbbed with rain and memory. Trust Raven. Her mom had written that just weeks before her death. Raven slowly turned her head, eyes locking with Ellie's. It wasn't a gaze of fear or even apology. It was recognition. It was a call. Robert knelt beside the puppy, checking him over. "He's okay," he said over his shoulder, voice shaken. "Ellie, honey, she saved him. The dog is this." His words fell away, because he saw it too. Raven stood still, not as a stray or survivor, but as something far older, something rooted in memory and purpose. The storm had eased into a slow, mournful drizzle. Steam rose from the road like ghosts. The forest around them crackled softly with the sound of wet leaves and distant thunder. Then the puppy, still shaking, let out a soft whimper. Raven nudged him gently with her nose, then took a step back and howled. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic, but it cut through the mist. like a song pulled from the bones of the earth itself, a cry that remembered everything. And Ellie, without thinking, stepped forward. For the first time in weeks, her body responded not with dread but instinct. Something inside her moved, something cracked open. The journal slipped from her fingers and hit the wet pavement with a dull slap. She didn't notice. She was looking at Raven, and Raven was looking at her. All at once, Ellie remembered the nights curled up in her mother's clinic, hiding under the desk after a panic attack, Raven's warm body curled protectively around her. She remembered the soft pressure of Raven's head on her lap, the steady heartbeat beneath fur that smelled of safety and home, and she remembered the fire, the smell of smoke, her mother's scream. The moment Raven pushed her out of the way, Ellie opened her mouth. At first, nothing came out. Then she let it go. A howl not like a dog's, but a child's torn from the raw, hidden place where grief had made its home. It wasn't beautiful, it wasn't clean, but it was the sound of life trying to return. The truck driver looked stunned. Robert stood speechless. Raven raised her head and howled again, this time stronger, louder. The puppy joined in a pitiful, high-pitched yelp that somehow didn't sound so alone anymore. And in that haunting chorus, Raven, the puppy, and Ellie, something ancient, stirred beneath the surface. A beginning, or perhaps the continuation of a promise. Ellie was only 5 when the neighbor's dog lunged at her. It was a blur of fur and teeth. A sunny afternoon turned red with panic. She had wandered too close to the gate, curious about the bouncing tennis ball inside the neighbor's yard. One second she was smiling, and the next she was screaming. The bite left a long scar running across her left calf. But the deeper wound wasn't the one that required stitches. It was the kind that stitched itself into fear, into the way her heart skipped at the sound of barking, into the way she crossed the street at the sight of even the smallest terrier. From that moment on, Ellie feared dogs, not just big ones, not just angry ones, all of them. Sarah, Ellie's mother, didn't believe in fear as a destination. A renowned child psychologist who specialized in trauma therapy, Sarah had devoted her career to helping children like her own daughter, but she didn't do it alone. Her greatest partner, her most trusted 4-legged colleague, was Raven. Raven wasn't just any dog. She was a giant pit bull with slate-gray fur, intelligent eyes, and the kind of quiet presence that filled a room without sound. To the kids Sarah worked with, Raven was magic. To Ellie, she was complicated, a creature that terrified her and intrigued her all at once. Sarah never forced Ellie to interact with Raven. She waited, sat with her in silence, let Raven sleep at the far end of the hall, let Ellie watch, then inch closer, then pet the dog's back one trembling finger at a time. Progress came slowly until one day Ellie giggled as Raven rested her massive head in her lap. That fragile piece, shattered 6 months ago. The car accident that took Sarah's life occurred on a rain-slicked road just outside of town. Ellie was in the back seat. She remembered the screech of tires, the smell of gasoline, her mother's voice saying, "Hold on." Then darkness. She woke in the hospital with a fractured leg. And no mother. Raven, who had been in the back of the SUV, was gone. Some said she had run off after the crash. Others whispered she had been hit. No body was ever found. Robert Miller, Ellie's father, changed after that. Once patient, once playful, he became silent, then stern. Grief hardened into rules. Emotion became threat. And above all, there was a new law in the house. No dogs. "They don't belong with us anymore," Robert would say. When Ellie asked about Raven, "They belong out there in the wild." What he meant was that Raven had abandoned them, that somehow the dog had contributed to the chaos that stole his wife. Ellie didn't believe that, not really, but she was too afraid to argue, too broken to hold anything together herself. The scar on her leg was new. It pulled every time she walked, a physical echo of the limp that hadn't fully healed. But the deeper pain, the one she didn't talk about, was the way silence filled their home. Now, there were no bedtime stories, no garden herbs picked with her mother on Saturday mornings. Just the ticking clock and the occasional crackle of radio weather reports from her dad's shed. Then came the journal. She had found it tucked between cookbooks in the kitchen, the soft leather cover worn from years of use, her mother's handwriting looping elegantly across the pages. At first, Ellie was scared to read it, afraid the words would make the loss more real. But one rainy evening, curled in the corner of the couch while thunder rumbled outside, she opened it. Most of it was filled with case notes, ideas for new therapy programs, lists of herbs and dog treats, but tucked between the margins were thoughts about Ellie, about Raven. And one line that stopped Ellie cold. "If I ever lose Raven," it read, "don't force Ellie to look. Let her choose when she's ready. Raven will know. Raven will wait." Ellie read it over and over, her fingers trembling. It was as if her mother had left a breadcrumb trail just for her, a whisper across time. Raven is out there. She's waiting. Since the accident, Ellie had started hearing things at night. Not voices, but howls. Low, mournful cries that drifted in from the woods beyond their house. At first, she told herself it was just wind, just coyotes. But one night, standing at her bedroom window with the journal pressed to her chest, she whispered Raven's name, and the sound came again, a long, aching howl that made her bones hum. She hadn't told her father. He wouldn't believe her. He would say it was her imagination, or worse, tell her to forget. But she couldn't. She wouldn't. Ellie began to dream about Raven, half memory, half mystery. In one dream, Raven stood at the edge of a forest, her eyes glowing in the dark. Behind her, a smaller dog with storm-colored fur whimpered. Raven turned to Ellie, eyes locked, and Ellie heard her mother's voice, not from Raven's mouth, but from somewhere deeper. Trust her. Each night, she waited at the window. Each morning, she listened for paw prints in the mud, and always that howl would come again, like a ghost refusing to fade. Then came the day of the thunderstorm, the day the car skidded to a stop on the highway, and Raven emerged like a phantom from the past. It wasn't over. Not the fear, not the bond, and definitely not the story. The forest was quiet again, too quiet for something so wild and alive. Only the wind whispered between the trees, brushing the last leaves of autumn like a mother's fingertips tracing a child's brow. Somewhere deeper in the woods, something small was breathing fast, shallow, afraid. Storm's tiny paws left trembling prints in the mud. The little Pitbull pup, barely 10 weeks old, had been running for what felt like forever, his white-tipped feet, the only sign that he was different from his siblings, were caked in mud and blood. His body shook with exhaustion, and his belly growled with hunger, but he didn't cry, not anymore. He had used up all his crying the night before. When the sky split open and the world turned into fire and teeth, it started with a low growl in the dark. Then came the eyes gleaming like broken glass in the underbrush. The hyenas had come out of nowhere, driven from the north by drought and desperation. They attacked with no warning. His mother, Raven, had barely enough time to shove him behind a fallen log with the others before she lunged at the largest invader. He remembered her eyes, locked on his run. Hide. Survive. She didn't say the words, but he understood. The pack scattered. Chaos swallowed the clearing. One by one, the shadows took his brothers and sisters. He heard yelps, short, sharp, silenced. The log cracked under his paws. Storm had no choice but to bolt in the opposite direction, away from the blood, the claws, and the smoke. And now he was alone. He hadn't seen his mother since, but even now, even as his legs gave out beneath him near the roots of an old pine, he believed she would come, because Raven always came back. She was the one who licked his face after every fall, the one who curled around him at night like a fortress made of fur and warmth. Raven didn't leave. She searched. She fought. So he waited, and somewhere, not too far away, a girl stood at the edge of her porch, her breath clouding in the cold. Ellie didn't know why she was awake. She had been tossing in bed, haunted by the smell of wet earth and the sound of tires screeching. Her ankle ached again. The old scar on her calf pulsed, like it remembered something she had tried to forget. She stepped outside, barefoot, despite the chill. The woods loomed just beyond the fence, and for the first time in years, she didn't flinch. There was a sound, a long, mournful call, like a song made of loneliness and hope. A howl. Not quite wolf, not quite dog. Something in between. She clutched the worn leather cover of the journal tighter to her chest. Her mother's handwriting had always been elegant, even in its final pages, and one line had kept repeating itself in her head. Trust Raven. She'll know when the time is right. She had never understood what her mom meant. But now, standing there in the dark, heart pounding like a drum against her ribs, she thought maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of it. In the forest, Storm lifted his head. The stars blinked through the branches above him, and the cold kissed his ears. He was shaking from head to tail. But when he heard that sound, something like a voice on the wind, his ears perked. Not a howl this time, a whisper. Soft. Human. Raven. He didn't understand the word, but the name felt like warmth. Like milk. Like safety. He dragged himself to his feet and stumbled forward. Raven had left signs behind. Broken branches bent. Just so. Claw marks near water sources. Even a swatch of her black fur, tied into tree bark with her teeth, a message to any living thing that dared come too close. I will return. She had chosen to lead the surviving pups east, away from the hunting zone, but she would return for Storm. She always knew where he was. He had her blood, her heart. He was her son. Ellie didn't sleep that night. She sat on the back steps, journal open, tracing the words with her fingers again and again. Raven will know. The wind howled, then softened. The clouds parted. And in that strange stillness before dawn, she felt it, that unseen thread tying her to something else out there. A dog? No. A pup. Crying. Shivering. Alone. And for the first time since she was 5 years old, Ellie didn't feel fear. She felt purpose. 2 children, 2 survivors, one walking on 2 legs, the other on 4, were about to find each other, not by accident, but by something greater, something their mothers had always known. The road was quiet again. After a night of violent storms, the morning air smelled like wet bark and unsettled secrets. Ellie sat in the passenger seat of her father's old truck, arms crossed tightly over her chest, her gaze fixed on the winding road ahead. The silence between her and Robert was heavy, broken only by the occasional squeak of windshield wipers clearing remnants of rain. They were on their way to the outskirts of Pine Hollow, delivering canned goods to a small animal shelter, her father's attempt to get her out of the house, to do something real instead of reading that journal over and over. Ellie didn't argue, not because she agreed, but because part of her wanted to believe that getting out might silence the noise in her head, the echoes of the storm, the cry of the animal, the feeling that something had been watching her from the woods last night. They turned a sharp corner, and that's when Ellie gasped. Up ahead, beside the road, sat a small, shivering figure, mud-caked fur, white-tipped paws, ribs slightly showing. A pup. Not just any pup. That's him, Ellie whispered. That's the one from the forest. From the dream. Robert's brows knit. You sure? Before she could answer, the pup turned his head, his eyes, dark and full of something ancient, locked onto hers. Ellie reached for the door handle, instinctively. No, Robert warned, his voice firm. You stay put. It might be sick or wild. But Ellie had already pushed the door open. She stepped into the soft mud, the cold biting through her sneakers. Her hands trembled as she approached the animal. It's okay, I won't hurt you, she said gently, inching closer. Storm didn't run, but he didn't move forward either. He crouched low, tail tucked, trembling. Ellie took another step, then another. Her breath quickened, her heart pounded against her ribs. The closer she got, the louder her old fear screamed inside her, and then he growled. A soft, broken sound. Ellie froze. Her childhood trauma surfaced in full, color-sharp teeth. Pain, her mother's scream, the flashing red of the ambulance. She stumbled backward, tripping into the mud. Robert rushed forward, pulling her away. That's it, he said. We call someone. Within 10 minutes, a black truck rolled up, its engine too smooth, too quiet. A man stepped out, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a uniform that vaguely resembled animal control, but lacked any official insignia. His name tag read Clay Morgan. But the way he scanned the woods before speaking sent a chill down Ellie's spine. I heard there was a stray causing trouble, he said with a rehearsed grin. Robert gestured toward the pup. My daughter spotted him. Might be sick. Clay knelt with practiced ease, pulling out what looked like jerky. Come here, little guy. No one's going to hurt you. His voice was honeyed, too polished. Storm took a cautious step forward, and then Raven appeared. From across the road, through the early morning mist, a massive black figure emerged from the tree line, her body low to the ground, shoulders rippling with each step. Raven's deep, guttural growl sliced through the silence. Her eyes were locked on Clay. Storm whimpered. Ellie turned, heart hammering, the sight of Raven larger than she remembered. Scarred, drenched from the woods, was like watching a ghost crawl out of her mother's journal. The very name echoed in her skull. Raven? She murmured. Clay stood abruptly, slipping the jerky back into his pocket. You know this dog. She used to be. Ours. Ellie took a shaky step forward. She worked with my mom. Raven didn't growl at Ellie. In fact, the dog's ears twitched at the sound of her voice. For a moment, Ellie saw something flicker in the animal's expression. Recognition. Pain. Hope. Then Clay made his move. Subtly, he pressed a button on a small device clipped to his belt. Ellie caught it. The motion. The secrecy. And suddenly she remembered something from the journal. They don't come with collars. They come with silence. Raven always knew when not to trust the quiet ones. Wait, Ellie said. What are you doing? Clay smiled too wide. Just calling back up. Safety protocol. But Ellie felt it. Every nerve in her body was on fire with warning. She looked from Clay to Storm, then to Raven, whose growl had now deepened into a low, threatening snarl. Robert reached for his phone, but Ellie stepped forward. Her voice clear for the first time in weeks. Don't. What? Dad, he's not with animal control. Clay stiffened. Ellie turned to Storm. It's okay. You don't have to go with him. I know you're scared. I am too. Her voice cracked. But you're not alone. Storm whimpered again. Raven let out a short, sharp bark, her tail low but still. Then Ellie did something she hadn't done since she was 5 years old. She knelt down, opened her arms, and whispered, Come on. Storm looked from her to Raven, and then, slowly, he limped toward Ellie. Each step was a battle between fear and trust. Clay took a step forward. Raven roared. The sound was bone-shattering, part warning, part vow. Clay hesitated. Ellie wrapped her arms around Storm, shielding him. You're not taking him. Robert finally stepped beside them. Time for you to go, mister. Clay didn't argue. He gave a stiff nod, turned, and walked back to the truck. But just before he slammed the door, Ellie saw him press the earpiece in his left ear and speak softly. She has the pup. Confirm presence of mother. Prepare second team. The truck disappeared down the road. Ellie stood there, mud-soaked and breathless, holding Storm. Raven remained across the road, watching like a shadow bound by the forest. And in that moment, Ellie understood something deep and terrifying. This wasn't just a stray dog or a lost pup. This was something far bigger, a secret someone didn't want revealed. And Raven had returned not for revenge, but to protect what was hers. Robert's hands trembled as he stepped between Clay Morgan and the children, because that's what they were to him now, his daughter and that small, wide-eyed pup. He hadn't seen Ellie look that brave in years, hadn't seen that fire in her since before the accident. The last time she'd stood tall like that, she was still holding Sarah's hand. You need to step back, Robert growled, his voice rough with age and regret. Clay narrowed his eyes. You have no idea what you're interfering with, old man. Robert's jaw clenched. He didn't care about threats. He didn't care that this man wore fake rescue gear, or that the black van behind him had tinted windows and no license plate. All he cared about was the look on his daughter's face, one that held more courage than he had ever given her credit for. Ellie stood frozen at first. Storm pressed against her knees. Her small fingers slowly reached down, brushing the soft fur of the pup's back. Storm didn't flinch. He looked up at her, big eyes reflecting a silent, sacred trust. The moment their eyes met, something inside Ellie shifted. The fear that had ruled her for so many years cracked. And through that fracture, love poured in like sunlight after a storm. "Ellie, get behind me," Robert ordered. But she shook her head. "No, Dad. He's not going to hurt anyone." Her voice was quiet, but it didn't waver. "Because we're not letting him," Raven, standing like a statue of stone and muscle, moved to the front. Her massive frame blocked Clay's path. Her eyes didn't blink. Her stance was no longer that of a domesticated dog, but of a sentinel, a mother, a guardian, a force of nature. Clay reached slowly into his coat pocket. Robert's eyes darted to the movement. "Don't," he barked, but it was too late. Clay yanked out a silver canister and clicked the top. Raven lunged forward, teeth bared, not to attack, but to position herself between Clay and Ellie once more. The hiss of the gas was cut short as Robert, in one swift, unlikely moment of precision, slammed the man's wrist with his flashlight. The canister flew into the wet grass. Clay snarled and stumbled back, reaching for a radio on his belt. "Get them now!" he shouted into the static. "The pup and the girl. Don't let them." But his words were silenced by the wail of sirens. In the distance, blue and red lights shimmered through the trees like divine retribution. Robert's call to the sheriff had been brief, but clear, and apparently they had been watching Clay Morgan for a while. Within seconds, deputies swarmed the road, weapons drawn but voices calm. Clay didn't even try to run. His face twisted into something between rage and disbelief as he dropped the radio and raised his hands. Raven didn't move. Her eyes tracked him until the cuffs clicked around his wrists. Then, and only then, did she turn to her son, to Ellie. Storm pressed his head against Ellie's leg, and she bent down, slowly, placing both arms around him. No fear. No panic. Just breathless awe. "I touched him," she whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. "I didn't even shake." Robert watched her, heart thudding with something he hadn't felt in so long he nearly forgot the name for it. Pride. Years of therapy, of stern warnings and avoidance, hadn't reached her, but in a single act of trust from a dog, and maybe from a mother's voice long gone, Ellie had returned to herself. He stepped forward, kneeling slowly beside her. "Ellie," he said softly. You okay?" She nodded. I think Raven came back for us." "For him." "For me." Robert looked at Raven. Their eyes met, and for a fleeting second, he swore he saw something he didn't believe dogs could express. Recognition, a nod to shared grief, in understanding. The sheriff approached, briefed them quickly on the investigation. Clay was part of a larger ring targeting stray and wild canines, mostly high-value breeds abandoned after disasters. They'd been monitoring his movements for weeks, but Raven's sudden appearance had forced their hand. As they talked, Raven sat beside her pup, and Ellie like she'd always belonged. Her coat was soaked, matted in places, but her presence was undeniable. She wasn't just a dog. She was something else now, a bridge between the past and the future. Ellie sat quietly, her hand on Storm's back. The sun began to rise beyond the tree line, golden light slicing through the mist. The chaos had calmed, but none of them would ever be the same. Robert exhaled long and slow. "I think your mom, she'd be proud of you," he said. Ellie smiled, eyes glistening. "I think." She sent Raven back, and maybe, just maybe, Robert believed that, too. He stood, brushing dirt from his knees, and looked at the road, then at Raven and Storm. "What now?" he asked aloud. Ellie didn't answer at first. She just kept petting Storm, her touch gentle and rhythmic. Then she looked up and said, "We bring them home." The rain had stopped, but the world was still soaked in the silence that follows a storm. The back door creaked open, just enough to let the massive frame of Raven slip through. Storm, smaller but with the same intense eyes and thick coat, followed closely at her side. Their paws left damp prints on the old hardwood floor prints that echoed a past life now returning, cautiously, step by step. The house smelled like rosemary and old books, faintly layered with the scent of something that had once been home. Raven sniffed the air, slow and methodical. Her body tensed for a moment at the threshold, as if she were expecting someone or something lost to time to step out and greet her. Instead, it was Ellie who stood before her, holding something in her trembling hands. The object wasn't a toy, not a treat, but something far more sacred. Her mother's journal. The leather cover was worn, corners curled, the binding cracked from years of careful use. Ellie had kept it by her bed, under her pillow, in her backpack, anywhere it could feel close. It was more than a diary. It was her map back to love, back to understanding, back to a mother who believed in things no one else could see. She knelt on the floor, knees touching the ground beside Raven, and opened it to the bookmarked page. Her voice was quiet at first, unsure if the words were meant to be heard by someone who couldn't speak back. "Every creature deserves kindness," she read, the words soft but steady, especially the ones that can't ask for it. The line hung in the air like a prayer caught in wind chimes. Raven took one step closer. Ellie held her breath. For a moment, nothing moved, not the air, not time, not the grief that had lived so long inside her. Then Raven leaned in, her nose brushing gently against Ellie's open hand. The Pitbull's tongue flicked out, warm and gentle, barely a whisper against Ellie's skin. Ellie didn't pull away. Her fingers curled instead, curling not in fear, but in response, in acceptance, in something so much older than fear, something called trust. Tears welled up in her eyes, not because she was scared, but because the moment felt too big for words. She let them fall freely, like the last drops of the storm still trickling from the leaves outside. Robert stood in the kitchen doorway, silent. He didn't move. He just watched the girl he had spent years trying to protect from pain, now face it head on and open her arms to it. Watched the dog he had blamed for everything wrong quietly reclaim her place. Not with violence, not with demand, but with patience and dignity. Through the wide glass window that lined the back of the living room, a single beam of light broke through the overcast sky. It stretched across the floor like a golden bridge, one that connected Raven, Ellie, and the small bundle of fur, now curled up beside them, Storm. The little pup had already begun to understand what humans call home. He nudged closer to Raven, laying his head against her chest. His eyes fluttered closed. Raven curled protectively around him. And then, something unexpected happened. Storm shifted again this time, into Ellie's lap. His weight was warm, his body trembling just slightly. But there was no hesitation. Ellie's hands instinctively reached around him. She pulled him close, the tears still rolling, now falling into Storm's soft fur. She whispered, "You came back to me." Whether she meant Storm or Raven or some piece of herself she thought had been lost forever, even she wasn't sure. Maybe she meant all of them. Raven, watching, gave a quiet huff of approval. Not quite a bark, not quite a sigh, just a sound that said, "I see you." I remember, it was that moment, quiet and unremarkable to the outside world, that became the beginning of something extraordinary. Robert walked over slowly. Still unsure of what his presence meant in this new chapter, he knelt beside Ellie, one knee cracking audibly in protest. She didn't look up, but she didn't flinch when he placed a hand on her shoulder. "She believed in this," Ellie whispered. "I know," Robert replied, his voice low. I didn't know how to hold on to what she left behind." "You don't have to," Ellie said, now looking at him with a clarity he hadn't seen since Sarah's funeral. "We can hold it together." They sat like that for a while. The three of them, no, the five of them, Raven, Storm, Ellie, Robert, and the memory of Sarah that still lingered in every corner of that house. It wasn't long before Storm was fast asleep, one paw resting gently across Ellie's wrist. Raven lay beside them, her great chest rising and falling in steady rhythm, her eyes only half closed, ever watchful. Outside the window, the sun finally broke through completely. It wasn't the dramatic blaze of color that comes at sunset. It was gentler than that, like morning after a nightmare, like breath returning after you didn't even realize you were holding it. Robert stood up first. They can stay, he said, not looking at Ellie. But out the window, as long as you want, as long as they need. Ellie didn't reply. She didn't need to. Her smile said enough. It was the first real one he'd seen in over 2 years. Upstairs, in the room that had once belonged to Sarah and now belonged to her journal, the wind nudged the window open just slightly. A breeze drifted in, brushing gently against the pages. And somewhere, as if whispered through the walls, her voice echoed again. Sometimes, we have to lose something to find what truly matters. Outside, the prints left by Storm and Raven were already beginning to dry. But inside, something new had begun to bloom. The forest was still damp from the rainstorm 2 days earlier. Mist curled around the trunks of the tall pines, weaving through the air like whispers, too shy to speak aloud. Ellie followed closely behind Raven, the giant pit bull moving with surprising grace through the underbrush, her head low, ears twitching at the softest sounds. Storm padded beside them, his little white-pawed feet nearly silent, his bright eyes flicking between Ellie and his mother. They had been walking for nearly an hour when Raven stopped in a small clearing. The silence felt sacred. Then, with a low whine, Raven turned her head and let out a gentle, throaty sound. Not quite a bark, not quite a call, but something in between, a sound of memory, of calling something home. And then, rustling, from beneath a thick fern, 2 tiny shapes emerged, Pitbull pups, smaller than Storm, one with a soft gray coat, and the other black, with a white blaze across her snout. They were trembling, hesitant. Ellie dropped to her knees instinctively, hands out but unmoving, giving them time. Raven moved slowly, nudging them forward with her nose. She brought us here for them, Ellie whispered. She remembered. Robert, who had trailed behind quietly, stood back, his face unreadable at first, but when the 2 puppies tumbled into Raven's side, nuzzling close, and Storm barked a tiny, excited yip of welcome, something broke in his expression. His hands unclenched. They gathered the dogs gently. The walk back felt different, lighter. Back at home, Robert began work on what he called a crazy idea. But Ellie knew better. It started with clearing the old shed, where Sarah once kept her gardening tools. Then came insulation, fencing, and soft bedding. By the 3rd week, the sign was hung. Sarah's shelter, carved carefully by hand. The name gleamed in the morning sun. Beneath it, a simple phrase, kindness begins with trust. The news spread quickly. A few calls to old veterinary friends, Sarah's former colleagues, and the local rescue network. And soon, abandoned or injured dogs began arriving. Robert, once strict and afraid, became something else entirely: patient, focused, purposeful. One rainy morning, Ellie found him sitting in the shelter, brushing a matted coat of a limping stray. He looked up and smiled, tired but real. I was wrong, he said quietly. About Raven. About all of this, she didn't answer. She just sat beside him and helped. Ellie had started journaling again, something she hadn't done since her mother died. She kept her entries simple, honest, like Sarah always had. Today, Raven taught me how to be brave. Storm barked at the wind and then fell asleep on my shoes. Dad made pancakes for the shelter volunteers and didn't burn them. Raven seemed to have found her place again, too. She would patrol the yard at dusk, then sit at the edge of the porch, watching the forest, as if guarding something sacred or remembering something painful. Ellie never tried to guess. She simply sat next to her, sometimes with Storm in her lap, and let the silence do the talking. One evening, a man arrived with a wounded golden retriever. He was tall, weathered, and had the look of someone who had spent too long avoiding mirrors. I heard about the shelter, he said. He was my wife's dog. She passed. I just can't, Robert nodded, took the leash. No judgment. Later that night, Ellie found the man crying quietly on the back steps, Raven sitting beside him, just sitting. That's when Ellie knew. The shelter wasn't just for the dogs. It was for all of them. Weeks turned into months. The forest bloomed again. Storm grew fast, strong and gentle like his mother. The two other pups, now named Juniper and Scout, became official members of the family, as Ellie called them. One autumn afternoon, Ellie stood by the window, watching Robert chase Storm around the garden. With a chewed-up slipper in hand, she turned to her journal and wrote, "We're all healing. Together, some of us with fur, some of us with old scars." Later that day, she walked to porch, sat beside Raven, and pulled out Sarah's journal again. There was a passage she hadn't noticed before, hidden between loose pages near the back. It read, "If I'm ever not there to guide her, I hope Ellie remembers this. Sometimes the broken parts are where the light gets in." Ellie closed the book, her eyes misting. She looked at Raven. "You brought us back together," she whispered. All of us, as if on cue, Storm ran up the steps and flopped onto her lap. His big puppy body now almost too heavy. Raven nudged them both and then curled up beside them. Robert joined them with mugs of cocoa, and for a moment, the world felt whole. The sun dipped behind the trees. Light danced through the branches like gold dust. Ellie held Storm tighter, resting her head against Raven's broad shoulder. "We're not broken anymore, are we?" she said softly. Raven lifted her head, eyes glowing amber, and let out a low, peaceful sigh, almost like a yes. And from the forest, the wind carried back no longer a lonely howl, but something that sounded almost like a lullaby. In the quiet glow of twilight, as the forest whispered its lullabies, a girl, a Pitbull mother, and her 3 pups sat together, not as broken beings, but as a family reborn. This is not just the story of Raven and Storm. It's the story of all of us, of wounds that don't bleed but ache, of trust rebuilt where there was once only fear, and of how sometimes love doesn't bark, it simply waits. Ellie found her strength not through words, but through silence shared with a creature who once saved her mother's life. Robert, once hardened by grief, found purpose in a shelter built in his wife's name. And Raven? She didn't just protect, she remembered. She returned. She kept a promise. As we close this chapter, remember what Maya Angelou once said, "I've learned that people will forget what you said, but they will never forget how you made them feel." If this story touched you, even for a moment, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support is the heartbeat that keeps stories like these alive. A simple click might help us reach 1,000 subscribers and fuel more stories filled with warmth, wonder, and second chances. What did this story remind you of? A pet you once loved? A moment of bravery you didn't think you had? Leave us a comment. Let's keep the story going. Together,